Layered air defenses were supposed to be the key to Iran's success. With those defenses, it could limit the US to only using its stealth bombers and fighter jets. Anything else would be shot down. But those plans are long dead. Now the US has AH-64 Apaches and A-10 Warthogs operating in Iran. They're raining hell down on Iran's military, playing their part in wiping it off the map with strikes so out of this world that Iran never thought it could be hit like this. And how is this happening? Because the US has achieved air supremacy in Iran. If you know him, you love him, US Secretary of War Pete Hegseth said on March 26th, when declaring that Apache choppers and A-10 Warthogs are flying with impunity in Iranian airspace. And Apache helicopter gunships are flying strike missions inside Iranian airspace and throughout the Strait of Hormuz at will, Hegseth added. And what this tells us is that Iran has no air defense answers for the airstrike problems that the US is posing. These airframes aren't stealthy, they're far from it in fact. Hegseth describes them as slow and low flying, at least when compared to the likes of the F-35 and B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. And that fact alone tells you just how badly Iran's air defenses have been degraded. You only send these slow, low-flying, close air support platforms when the enemy has no meaningful air defenses left, Hegseth said during his statement. And while this may seem like a bold statement, it's mostly true. Apaches and A-10s are able to fly because Operation Epic Fury and Operation Roaring Lion have done a real number on Iran's air defenses. By March 5th, the Israeli Defense Force or IDF Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Eyal Zamir was claiming that the destruction or disabling of 80% of Iran's air defense systems had been achieved within the first 24 hours of strikes against the country starting. What this means for Iran is that it's left with isolated air defense nodes, often little more than soldiers operating shoulder-mounted defenses, in response to strikes that are over faster than those troops can react. The layered Iranian defenses have been rendered practically irrelevant by the US and Israel. However, Zamir's comments don't tell the full story. Iran's air defense problems started long before Operation Epic Fury and Operation Roaring Lion were launched. As far back as December 12th, Forbes was reporting that Iran faced critical air defense gaps against Israel and, as we later found out, the US. The country's former president Hassan Rouhani was scathing in his assessment of these defenses as he said, "The skies over Iran have become completely safe for the enemy. We no longer have real deterrence. Our neighboring countries, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, all have airspace controlled by the United States and Israel." In other words, the US and Israel had bases close enough to Iran to enter practically at will, even before Operation Epic Fury began. That was a problem, as was the fact the US and Israel had already dominated Iran's air defenses once before. During June's Operation Midnight Hammer, which led to the 12-day war between Iran and Israel, a lot of Iran's air defenses were destroyed in hours. That's the problem behind the problem for Iran. As impressive as taking out 80% of the country's air defenses might sound, the real reason why Iran has failed so spectacularly to prevent A-10s and Apaches from flying in its airspace is that those defenses were compromised before those platforms ever arrived. By the time Operation Epic Fury began, Army technology reports, Iran's regime had only 100 or so air defense launchers left, and it seems unlikely that these launchers would have been compatible with all the missiles Iran would have wanted and needed to use against the US as its airstrikes commenced. Iran was onto a loser from the start. A little over half a year was nowhere near enough for it to get its air defense network back up to the strength that it was when Israel and US had hobbled it back in June. That fact is why Apaches and A-10s are now able to wipe military targets off the map all over Iran. If Iran had air defenses, this wouldn't be possible. The Apache alone is an easy target for modern air defense systems. With a service ceiling of just 20,000 feet, it should be strikeable even by the older Russian and Chinese air defense systems that are supposed to make up Iran's air defense network. The S-300, for instance, which we know is in Iran, is reportedly able to strike targets as high as 19 miles in the sky. Granted, that figure applies to the most modern version of the S-300. But it's still about 5 times the altitude that an Apache can reach at its absolute maximum, and older variants of the system can fire missiles that also far exceed the Apache's service ceiling. The fact the Apache is flying in Iran at all indicates that Hegseth is right on the money about Iran's air defenses. At least he is for the most part. We can't ignore the fact that 80% isn't 100%. Iran still has some air defense systems, though what they are and where they're located isn't known. Still, as Army recognition points out, A-10s and Apaches operating over the Strait of Hormuz indicates that the US has, at the very least, created large, localized pockets of air superiority, and it's likely able to keep those channels open through a combination of electronic warfare, forward basing, and the suppression of any air defenses that Iran tries to deploy to counter the US aircraft. Superiority is also evolving into Supremacy, which would mean that the US has even greater control over Iran's airspace. But before we get to that, let's focus on how the US is using its A-10s and Apaches in Iran. Hegseth's remarks suggest that the primary focus for both has been repeated sorties over Iran's waterways, with a particular focus on the Strait of Hormuz. If that's the case, then these are definitely platforms that come with capabilities that make them perfectly suited for that particular job. The A-10, with its titanium armor, multiple redundant flight systems, ability to fly low, and of course, its steel-shredding GAU-8A 30mm cannon, seems almost purpose-built to deal with the fast attack boats that Iran has been using against merchant ships attempting to sail through the strait. Though originally designed as a tank killer that could provide support to ground forces, the A-10 has come into its own as an all-rounder platform that can be deployed when an enemy's air defenses have been taken down. Fast boats are being crippled by the A-10's cannons, but we also can't underestimate the airframe in terms of its usability and strikes against targets on the Iranian mainland. After all, we've already seen footage of an A-10 using its cannons to shred through a base used by an Iranian proxy militia group in Iraq, so we know that it's attacking targets on land as well as at sea. That attack saw the A-10 use its cannon. Others have likely seen it use the standoff munitions that can be loaded onto the platform. This is a warplane that can rattle off AGM-65 Maverick missiles and both laser and GPS-guided bombs, both of which are designed to be launched miles away from the intended target, which minimizes the threat posed by air defenses at those targets in the process. AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles can also be packed into the A-10, making it an air-to-air threat against Iranian drones and the older aircraft in Iran's air force. Versatility is the key with the A-10. While its work in the Strait of Hormuz may be the most important in terms of stripping away a key lever that Iran has been trying to use to force an end to Operation Epic Fury, the A-10's versatility means that it can be used anywhere in Iran. Yes, it's vulnerable to modern air defense systems such as the S-300 we mentioned earlier, but that's where America's air superiority comes into play. As long as the A-10s stay in the pockets of safe space that the US and Israel have created, it's a destruction-dealing machine that comes loaded with so much firepower that its targets must think that the end times have come every time they're hit. As for the Apache helicopters, they're not quite as versatile as the A-10. However, they do come with Hellfire missiles and 30mm chain guns, which again make them very useful in the Strait of Hormuz. The Apache is fast enough to track and strike Iran's fast attack boats. Plus, it's a chopper. That means it can hover and fly slowly enough to serve as an escort to US Navy and merchant ships attempting to make their way through the strait. Sustained operations in contested airspace will be risky for this attack helicopter, as its range, speed, and vulnerability to both infrared and radar-guided threats make it a target. But like the A-10s, America's Apaches aren't being hit. Iran just doesn't have what it needs to strike them. And that, perhaps even more than the percentages that the IDF has been throwing around, is proof that control over Iran's skies now belongs to the US. What we're now seeing is a high-intensity campaign that is being reinforced by these non-stealth platforms. As of March 25th, the US has struck at least 10,000 targets in Iran. That's struck targets, not fired 10,000 munitions. This is an air campaign on such a scale that it will be impossible for the US to pull off with just a handful of different airframes. High-capacity platforms, such as America's old bombers and the A-10, are needed to maintain sustained firepower that supports fighter jets and stealth bombers running more surgical sorties throughout Iran. The impact on Iran's military has been devastating. Leaders have been getting killed left and right, starting with former Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, who was one of the first victims of Operation Epic Fury. The US claims that 92% of Iran's naval vessels have been taken out of the equation and that its missile launches are down by 90% due to a concerted campaign to take out its missile launch sites. Command and control centers are being hit hard, and the same goes for production facilities, and the A-10 seems to be at the center of it all. The fast boats in the Strait of Hormuz have to deal with the combination of this versatile attack aircraft and the Apache chopper. On land, any military node that doesn't have air defenses, which seems to be most of them at this point, is likely to get a visit from an A-10 or something. Iran's missile infrastructure in particular has taken a severe beating from the US in its air power. On March 29th, the Washington Post published satellite images that showcased the damage done to some of Iran's most important launch sites. At least 29 of Iran's ballistic missile launch sites have been wiped off the map since Operation Epic Fury began, the outlet says, which is a huge contributor to the sharp decline in Iranian missile launches that we've seen since early March. The US has also been attacking sites that are critical to the production of Iran's ballistic missiles. An entire network of these sites exists in Iran, all of which are overseen by the Iranian Ministry of Defense and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. So far, the US has struck 4 of the most important sites in that network, all of which make fuel for the ballistic missiles that Iran wants to produce. Shahrud, Parchin, Qojir, and Hakimiyya have all sustained damage that is even greater than what was inflicted upon them during Iran's 12-day war with Israel. These are smart targets. Even the most well-built missiles aren't going anywhere if they don't have fuel and launchers. And as Iran's air defenses have been degraded, America's A-10s have been flying, along with many other airframes, and delivering bombs and standoff munitions right to the hearts of these types of facilities. But it gets even better than that for the A-10. Do you remember earlier we discussed how the groundwork for the destruction of Iran's air defense network had been laid before Operation Epic Fury began? The A-10 seems to have been involved in the obliteration of what was left of Iran's air defenses from the very early days of Operation Epic Fury. Army Recognition explains, noting that a key factor for why Apaches and A-10s are in Iran right now lies in America's early establishment of air superiority. Stealth platforms like the F-35 and B-2 Spirit grabbed all of the headlines during the first few days of the operation, as they were able to fly into Iran undetected to deliver firepower to critical military nodes. F-22s were also part of earlier waves, again because they have the stealth capabilities to ensure that they're not shot down by Iran's air defenses. All of that makes sense, but the presence of A-10s during this period doesn't. But what has happened is that the US was able to combine the use of these stealth platforms with cyber and electronic warfare, or EW, to degrade Iran's air defenses even when the systems themselves hadn't been destroyed. The disruption of Iran's radar and sensor networks, which the US pulled off with everything from space-based operations to EA-18G Growler aircraft loaded with EW equipment, created temporary corridors where the threat from air defenses was reduced. That opened the door for A-10s and later Apaches to move in, strike what they needed to strike, and get back out again before Iran's air defenses came back online. This approach also creates the possibility that A-10s were being deployed to conduct direct strikes against Iran's air defense units that have been compromised by cyber and EW operations. There's a level of irony in that approach. The very sort of platform those defenses should be able to counter is also responsible for their destruction. A-10s and Apaches are now flying with impunity over Iran, which tells us that the air superiority that we've talked about is on the verge of transforming into true aerial supremacy. Some already think that that is the situation in Iran, including former commander of US Central Command or CENTCOM and CIA Director David Petraeus. We're not concerned really at this point in time about air and ballistic defenses of Iran, as long as you stay above heavy machine gun range, and that means you can really just pour it on, Petraeus claims, adding, "I would argue that we actually have air supremacy now, not just air superiority, but I think folks are rightly cautious about those kinds of assessments publicly. Caution is indeed important. Iran's main air defense network may be out of the game, but it still has the machine guns and shoulder-mounted anti-air rocket launchers we mentioned earlier. Those high up in the US chain of command may still prefer to claim air superiority rather than air supremacy, but the reality seems to be that outside of isolated threats, the US can send almost any aerial platform that it wants into Iran's airspace and face virtually no resistance. The best that Iran has been able to muster is the damaging of an American E-3 Sentry, though even that required a missile strike against a base in Saudi Arabia rather than a missile fired from an anti-aircraft system. Perhaps former CENTCOM commander and US Marine Corps General Frank McKenzie sums it all up best when describing the state of Iran's military right now. "I think we're accomplishing the objectives that we set out. CENTCOM is executing a long, prepared campaign plan. We've been able to take out Iranian air defenses to the degree that I would argue we have effectively air supremacy over most of Iran. And what that has given us the opportunity to do is go hunt for ballistic missiles," McKenzie tells the Jewish Institute for National Security of America. That's 2 former CENTCOM commanders using the words air supremacy rather than air superiority. They're saying what the top brass in the US military structure right now won't say. This is where we're going to see things start shifting for Iran. The US is going to use its aerial bombardment, so they won't be at the sheer scale we've seen up to this point. They don't need to be. Most of Iran's military infrastructure has already been hit. As McKenzie notes, Iran's ballistic missile launch, storage, and production sites are now the big targets, and hitting those is a task that the A-10 is ideal for, given its use of standoff munition. A-10s will be sent into safe aerial pockets near Iran's missile sites, where they'll unleash their payloads and then head back to base. Those that aren't flying over the Iranian mainland are going to be spending their time dealing with fast boats in the Strait of Hormuz, along with the Apache helicopters that Hegseth has mentioned. The Wall Street Journal says that these two platforms are so important that they've essentially kicked off the battle for the Strait of Hormuz. It will likely take several weeks for the US to clear the strait of the anti-ship missile sites, fast boats, and other military assets that Iran has deployed in the waterway. The A-10s and Apaches are operating on the strait's southern flanks, says Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Dan Kane. America's allies are also using Apaches to handle one-way attack drones, Kane claims. Combine those two aircraft with the fighter jets that the US is deploying in the Strait of Hormuz, and you get a heady combination of firepower that makes it much riskier for Iran to conduct its Hormuz blockade. Riskier, yes, but not impossible. The strait is still very much blockaded, with only a small trickle of merchant vessels making it through. President Trump has extended Iran's deadline to fully reopen the strait until April 6th, so the next week will likely see more A-10 and Apache strikes to serve as reminders to Iran of how much firepower the US brings to the strait. Whether Iran capitulates to Trump's demand is the big question. If it does, the A-10s and Apaches will have done their job of degrading Iran's Strait of Hormuz posture to the point where the regime feels that it has no other point. But if Iran persists with its blockade, that's when troops might go in on the ground, where they could attack the islands in the Strait of Hormuz and focus on Karg Island, which is an economic lifeline for Iran. The US has been preparing for this type of operation. The biggest ground invasion in Iran's history may be about to go down, and you can find out all about it by checking out our video. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to see more of our Operation Epic Fury coverage. And thank you for watching.